In the year 79 AD, the people living in the shadow of Mount Vesuvius did not know what a volcano was. Nobody in the entire Roman world had any memory of this mountain doing what it was about to do. There was no warning in the stories passed down through generations. No word for the thing that was building beneath their vineyards and their villas. Vesuvius had simply always been there, green, quiet, unremarkable. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, that changed forever. What followed over the next day had never happened in recorded history and has never been fully repeated since. A column of ash and debris rose more than 30 kilometers into the sky and stayed there for 17 hours. Beneath it, entire cities were not destroyed in an instant. They were buried slowly, in stages, and each stage gave the people below a small window of time to decide what to do next. Those decisions are still preserved. The ash recorded where people went, what they carried with them, and where they were when everything finally stopped. In some places, the evidence is detailed enough to reconstruct a person's final hours almost moment by moment. Not far away, a second city met a completely different fate, one that would eventually produce some of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries ever recovered from an ancient disaster. And the most knowledgeable natural scientist in the Roman world made a choice that morning that cost him his life, sailing directly toward the eruption instead of away from it. Pompeii itself disappeared for nearly 17 centuries. When it was finally uncovered, the people who stepped inside it found something no living person had ever seen before: an entire Roman city sealed inside a single afternoon. Tonight, we go back to that afternoon. If you enjoy videos like this, kindly hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next one. And if you feel like sharing, let me know in the comments. What city or country are you listening from today? And what is the time over there? I love seeing how far across the globe these stories travel. Settle in and let's begin. Before ash, before darkness, before history fixed its gaze on this corner of Italy, there was a working city facing a bright bay. Pompeii stood along the Bay of Naples, home to somewhere between 11,000 and 20,000 people. It was not the capital of the Roman world, nor a seat of imperial power. Its importance came from movement, trade, and production. Ships arrived and departed, merchants negotiated prices, workshops transformed raw materials into goods that traveled across the empire. Wine from the surrounding countryside was widely admired. Olive oil filled storage vessels. Garum, a fermented fish sauce found on Roman tables from Britain to the eastern Mediterranean, flowed through its markets. Wool moved through local industries that supplied clothing far beyond the city walls. The city occupied about 64 hectares behind defensive walls. Streets crossed one another in a pattern influenced by Greek urban planning, creating an orderly framework for daily life. Water arrived through aqueducts and reached homes, fountains, baths, and businesses. An amphitheater capable of seating around 20,000 spectators hosted public entertainment. Temples stood beside civic buildings. Public baths welcomed visitors throughout the day. Bakeries produced bread in large quantities. Brothels, workshops, gardens, taverns, and food counters filled the spaces between grander structures. Seen as a whole, Pompeii contained nearly every layer of Roman urban society within a compact area. Many residents bought meals from Thermopolia, the fast food counters of the Roman world. Large jars were set into stone counters and held prepared foods or wine. A person could stop during work, purchase a meal, exchange news, and continue through the city. Graffiti covered walls nearby. Political endorsements, jokes, advertisements, and personal messages accumulated over years, creating a running conversation between neighbors, who often never met face to face. Above all of this rose Mount Vesuvius. To Roman eyes, it was a mountain. Its slopes supported vineyards that produced valuable wines. Forest covered parts of its upper reaches. Families farmed the land, inherited property, and built livelihoods in its shadow. The mountain's last eruption had occurred roughly 1800 years earlier, far beyond living memory and absent from local tradition. A geographer named Strabo had once remarked that its appearance hinted at volcanic origins, yet the observation remained little more than an interesting detail. One fact reveals the depth of this misunderstanding. About 2 years before the eruption, Pliny the Elder completed his vast work, Natural History. He cataloged the known wonders of the natural world, including famous volcanoes such as Etna and Stromboli. Vesuvius did not appear among them. The most knowledgeable natural scholar in Rome did not recognize the mountain for what it was. A short distance away stood Herculaneum, around 7 kilometers west of Vesuvius, which is about 4.3 miles. Smaller than Pompeii and generally wealthier, it occupied a cliff overlooking the sea. Elegant villas lined parts of the coast, attracting members of Rome's elite. For the people living in both cities, the relationship with the mountain felt ordinary. Children grew up beneath its slopes. Families worshipped, argued, celebrated, and planned futures there. Careers were built, elections were contested, messages were scratched into plaster walls. Vesuvius formed part of the landscape, as familiar as the bay itself, woven so completely into daily life that almost no one imagined it could become anything else. On the 5th day of February in the year 62, the ground around Pompeii ceased behaving like something permanent. Buildings trembled, walls split, and entire sections of the city lurched under forces no resident could see. Modern estimates place the earthquake between magnitude 5 and 6, centered close to Pompeii itself. Contemporary descriptions and archaeological evidence suggest shaking severe enough to rank among the highest levels of the Mercalli intensity scale, where well-built structures can fail and masonry can collapse in great quantities. Across the city, damage appeared almost everywhere. Temples lost columns and roofs. Sections of the Forum suffered heavy destruction. Aqueduct systems fractured, interrupting the movement of water that supported daily life. Homes developed cracks that spread through walls and foundations. Some buildings remained standing but were no longer safe to occupy. Others collapsed outright, leaving piles of stones scattered through streets that had seemed stable only moments earlier. One account came from the philosopher Seneca, who wrote about the disaster while discussing earthquakes more broadly. Among the details he preserved was the reported death of 600 sheep in the surrounding countryside. He believed poisonous vapors released from the earth had killed them. Viewed from the perspective of modern volcanology, the observation carries unusual significance. Gases escaping from stressed volcanic systems can accompany periods of geological unrest, leaving traces that later generations recognize more clearly than those who witnessed them. Deep below the vineyards and settlements of Campania, changes were already underway. Magma was gradually accumulating and shifting within the plumbing system of Mount Vesuvius. Pressure increased over years, deforming rock and transferring stress through the surrounding crust. The earthquake of 62 formed part of that process. It was one stage in a sequence that would continue for nearly 2 decades. The mountain possessed no voice, yet movement of the earth served as a kind of message transmitted through stone. Residents responded in the manner available to them. They repaired, rebuilt, and carried on. Construction crews restored damaged neighborhoods. Public buildings received attention. Wealthy homeowners renovated residences that had suffered structural harm. New decoration appeared beside fresh masonry, Economic activity returned. Life resumed its familiar rhythm, though signs of unfinished work remained visible for years. Another earthquake struck in 64. Smaller tremors followed across subsequent seasons. Springs weakened. Some wells produced less water than before. Changes like these are now recognized as possible indicators of volcanic unrest. For the people experiencing them, they belong to a different framework of understanding. Earthquakes were often interpreted through religion, ritual, and divine intention. The idea of a pressurized volcanic system operating beneath the region did not exist within Roman natural philosophy. This gap between observation and interpretation shaped everything. The evidence was present in fragments scattered across years, shaking ground, altered water supplies, strange reports from the countryside. Each formed part of a larger pattern that nobody could assemble. As reconstruction continued, Pompeii gradually became stronger, richer, and more refined than it had been before the earthquake. Decorative programs expanded, repairs improved older structures, new investments flowed into the city. By the late 70s, many districts were still being completed. The place approaching its finest moment was also living through the final years of a warning that had begun 17 years earlier. History preserved the date for centuries as late August, yet the ground itself appears to tell a different story. Archaeologists examining the city uncovered clues scattered among walls, food stores, and personal belongings. A charcoal inscription discovered in 2018 referred to a day in October. Pomegranates and chestnuts, fruits associated with autumn harvests, were present among the remains. Some victims wore heavier clothing than would normally be expected during an August day in southern Italy. Piece by piece, the evidence has persuaded many scholars that the eruption likely occurred during the latter part of October in the year 79. Whatever the exact day, the morning began in familiar fashion. Ovens glowed in bakeries before sunrise. Workers prepared dough, stacked fuel, and organized deliveries. Shopkeepers lifted shutters and arranged goods for customers. Food vendors readied meals for passers-by. Construction crews continued projects that had stretched across years of rebuilding. Hammers struck stone. Mortar was mixed. Repairs progressed in houses and public buildings that still carried traces of earlier earthquakes. Across the city, walls functioned as a public conversation. Pompeii contained thousands of graffiti inscriptions, preserved by chance and now read nearly 2,000 years later. Some messages supported political candidates, others advertised events or services. Poetry appeared beside insults. Declarations of affection shared space with complaints and jokes. One child practiced an alphabet on plaster. Someone else recorded a brief calculation. The city left fragments of its thoughts almost everywhere, creating a chorus of ordinary voices that no official history would have bothered to preserve. Near busy intersections stood thermopolia, places where hot food and wine could be purchased quickly. At least 80 of these establishments operated in Pompeii. Ceramic containers set into counters held prepared ingredients. Excavations have revealed traces of duck, goat, pig, fish, snails, and fava beans. One recently uncovered counter carried painted images of animals matching foods sold inside. The decoration worked as advertisement, menu, and artwork at the same time. Trade connected these small businesses to distant shores. Storage vessels, recovered from back rooms, originated from regions spread across the Mediterranean world. A customer buying a simple meal participated in a network extending far beyond the city gates. Cargo moved by ship, by wagon, and by human effort, linking farmers, merchants, sailors, and vendors into a single economic web. Population estimates suggest that not everyone remained in Pompeii that morning. Tremors had become more frequent in the preceding days. Some residents appear to have departed early, taking family members and valuables with them. Their absence would later leave subtle marks in the archaeological record. Even so, large numbers of people stayed behind. Earthquakes had been part of local experience for years. Another round of shaking could be troubling without seeming extraordinary. As midday approached, meals were served, purchases completed, repairs continued, and conversations drifted through streets that still felt familiar. The routines of work and domestic life carried forward through the early afternoon. Then, at approximately 1 in the afternoon, attention shifted upward. The people of Pompeii looked toward Mount Vesuvius. A cloud rising above a mountain is usually an ordinary thing. On this afternoon, one glance toward the summit revealed something entirely different. Around 1 in the afternoon, a member of Pliny the Younger's household noticed a strange formation growing over Mount Vesuvius and drew attention to it. Across the bay, Pliny the Elder stepped outside to observe. Far above the landscape, a towering mass was already climbing into the sky. The event had been preparing itself for years. Deep within the volcanic system, molten rock carried dissolved gases trapped under immense pressure. A hardened plug of older lava sealed the upper passageways of the mountain. As magma accumulated below, pressure increased with each passing year. The earthquakes that had troubled the region formed part of this process, a gradual loading of energy within the crust. Eventually, the strength of the rock above could no longer contain it. The mountain ruptured, releasing centuries of stored pressure in a violent upward burst. Material blasted from the crater at extraordinary speed. Ash, fragmented rock, volcanic gas, and molten debris surged high into the atmosphere. The column eventually reached somewhere between 20 and 33 kilometers in height, which is about 12.4 to 20.5 miles. Few natural events on Earth create structures of such scale. From a distance, observers watched the plume continue to rise, expanding upward until it resembled the crown of a Mediterranean pine tree. Pliny the Younger later described a tall central trunk supporting spreading branches at the top, an image that would survive for nearly 2,000 years. Modern volcanologists classify eruptions of this type as Plinian eruptions, a name chosen in honor of the account Pliny preserved. His description remains one of the most important eyewitness records ever written about a volcanic disaster. The explosion itself was heard across a vast area of southern Italy. People living many kilometers away recognized that something unusual had occurred. Following the initial detonation came a continuous roar. Gas escaping from the magma drove the eruption upward hour after hour. The sound persisted as fresh material fed into the column and carried it ever higher above the Bay of Naples. For residents of Pompeii, the earliest effect was not flame or intense heat. Light began to fade. The growing ash cloud spread across the sky and intercepted the afternoon sun. Streets that had been bright only moments before slipped into a strange dimness. Shadows deepened, colors flattened, daylight weakened with surprising speed. Pliny the Younger, observing from Misenum approximately 30 kilometers away, which is about 18.6 miles, later recalled a darkness unlike ordinary nightfall. His words compared it to a lamp extinguished inside a closed room. The image captured the abrupt disappearance of familiar light across the bay. Air currents played a decisive role during these first hours. Winds blowing toward the southeast carried most of the eruptive material directly over Pompeii. Herculaneum, positioned west of the volcano, lay outside the main path of the falling debris. geography, and weather combined to create very different experiences for neighboring communities. Above them all, the eruption column continued growing and sustaining itself. Hour after hour, fresh material poured upward, feeding a structure that remained suspended between earth and sky through the remainder of the day. The first stones arrived from a sky that could no longer be trusted. They were pale, porous fragments of volcanic rock, light enough to float on water, yet heavy enough to injure anyone standing exposed beneath their fall. Within roughly an hour of the eruption's beginning, these stones started descending onto Pompeii in steadily increasing numbers. At first, they may have seemed unusual but manageable. As the afternoon progressed, their persistence transformed them into a growing hazard that touched every street, courtyard, and rooftop. Pumice accumulated with surprising speed. Archaeological measurements indicate that the layer increased by around 15 centimeters each hour. That rate sounds modest when imagined on paper, yet cities are not designed to absorb a new layer of stone every few minutes. By evening, many streets lay under about 1 meter of pumice. By the following morning, before the most lethal stages of the eruption arrived, some locations had accumulated as much as 2.7 meters of material. Walking became increasingly difficult. Every step sank into unstable ground that had not existed earlier that day. Doorways narrowed, thresholds disappeared, carts became useless. Familiar routes changed shape as the city gradually rose under a blanket of volcanic debris. People attempting to move through Pompeii had to navigate a landscape that was rebuilding itself moment by moment. The danger extended upward as well. Individual pieces of pumice weighed little compared with ordinary stone, yet countless millions of fragments collected on roofs throughout the city. Roman buildings varied in quality and design. Strong structures endured the burden longer. Weaker roofs began to fail. Timber beams cracked. Tiles shifted. Entire sections collapsed into rooms where families had gathered for protection. Archaeologists can still distinguish many victims of this phase from those who died later. Bodies found beneath fallen roofing materials often show no evidence of exposure to extreme heat. Their deaths occurred through structural failure. The shelter they trusted became the source of the fatal blow. Faced with these conditions, residents confronted a difficult choice. Some remained indoors, believing thick walls offered the best chance of survival. Others decided movement carried less risk than waiting. Pliny the Younger later recorded that people tied pillows to their heads as protection from falling stones. The image survives across centuries, a practical adaptation created in the middle of uncertainty. Patterns preserved in the archaeological record suggest that decisions were shaped by circumstance as much as personality. Wealthier residents frequently possessed larger homes, businesses, and property worth protecting. Many appear to have delayed departure. People with fewer possessions often left sooner. Enslaved individuals and laborers may have exercised initiative before property owners reached a decision. Survival frequently favored those who moved early. Hours passed. Afternoon dissolved into a darkness that no longer followed ordinary rules of time. Pumice continued descending from above with steady determination. Streets rose higher. Roofs strained under increasing weight. Inside homes, conversations, calculations, and hopes unfolded behind closed doors. Outside, travelers worked their way toward city gates through deepening accumulations of stone. Throughout the night, the fall never truly stopped. The city endured beneath a continuous shower of rock, and each passing hour narrowed the range of choices still available. Along the waterfront of Herculaneum, the afternoon unfolded very differently. Residents could see the towering eruption above Mount Vesuvius, Yet the city itself escaped the punishment, falling elsewhere. Fine ash drifted through the air and settled across rooftops, but the dense shower of pumice that transformed Pompeii never arrived in significant quantity during those first hours. Geography and weather combined in a way that seemed favorable. Herculaneum stood about 7 kilometers west of the volcano, which is about 4.3 miles. The prevailing wind carried most of the eruptive material toward the southeast. Because of that shift in direction, the great plume passed largely away from the town. Buildings remained standing. Streets stayed navigable. Roofs carried little additional weight. Compared with conditions elsewhere around the bay, daily life retained a surprising degree of normality. From elevated points within the town, people could observe the growing catastrophe unfolding across the region. The eruption dominated the horizon. A cloud of debris expanded higher and broader with each passing hour. Even so, Herculaneum itself did not yet resemble a place facing immediate destruction. The difference between appearance and reality would become one of the defining features of its story. Many residents took advantage of the opportunity to leave. Archaeological evidence suggests that a large portion of the population evacuated during these early stages. Historians estimate that the majority escaped inland while roads remained usable. The city was smaller than Pompeii and generally wealthier. Families possessed resources, transport, and connections that may have aided departure. When excavations eventually uncovered Herculaneum, researchers found surprisingly few victims within homes, workshops, and streets compared with the number of people expected to have lived there. A smaller group chose another course. Roughly 300 individuals gathered near the shoreline in a series of arched stone chambers built into the sea wall. These boathouses opened toward the water and offered shelter while people waited for developments beyond their control. Excavations revealed a remarkable collection of possessions left beside them. Jewelry remained on fingers and wrists. House keys rested among personal belongings. One individual carried a complete surgeon's toolkit. Another appeared to be a military officer equipped with a sword and dagger. A woman discovered wearing gold rings became known among archaeologists as the Ring Lady. The objects tell a subtle story. These people had not abandoned hope. They selected valuables, practical tools, and items associated with future plans. Their belongings suggest preparation for departure, not acceptance of an ending. Attention turned toward the sea. Across the bay, ships from Misenum had been launched. News traveled imperfectly during disasters, yet the possibility of rescue remained plausible. Roman naval forces possessed experience, organization, and vessels capable of moving large numbers of people. Those waiting near the shore had reason to believe help might arrive from the water. As daylight faded, the boathouses became places of patience. Sulfur drifted through the air. Distant sounds from the eruption crossed the bay. Time stretched. Hours accumulated. The people gathered there had survived everything the volcano had delivered so far. Around them stood walls of stone, the sea before them, and a future that still appeared open. Across the Bay of Naples, while ash drifted through the darkened sky and people searched for routes away from danger, one of the most learned men in the Roman world was studying the eruption from the opposite shore. Gaius Plinius Secundus, remembered as Pliny the Elder, commanded the fleet stationed at Misenum, a major naval base about 30 kilometers from Vesuvius, which is about 18.6 miles. His reputation rested on an extraordinary ambition. Over decades, he had assembled knowledge from hundreds of sources and organized it into a monumental work known as Natural History. Spread across 37 volumes, it attempted to describe nearly every aspect of the known world: astronomy, geography, plants, animals, medicine, minerals, and countless other subjects found a place within its pages. According to his nephew, Pliny treated time as a resource never to be wasted. Meals became opportunities for study, travel became opportunities for dictation, books accompanied every part of his day. Curiosity shaped his life with unusual consistency. One detail gives his presence during the eruption a particular poignancy. He had written about volcanic landscapes elsewhere in the Mediterranean. He discussed famous fiery mountains known to Roman scholars. Yet the mountain dominating the bay before him did not appear in those discussions. Like nearly everyone around him, he did not understand what Vesuvius truly was. As the eruption expanded, a message arrived. A woman named Rectina, wife of a friend called Tatius Pomponianus, found herself trapped near the mountain. Falling debris had made escape by land increasingly difficult. Her letter requested help from the fleet. What had begun as an object of scientific interest immediately became a humanitarian emergency. Pliny responded with remarkable speed. Warships were prepared for launch, transforming observation into rescue. His nephew later recorded that, amid the preparations, Pliny continued examining the strange cloud above the bay. He dictated descriptions of its form and changing appearance while sailors readied the vessels. The habits that had defined his life remained intact even as he moved toward an event unlike anything he had previously encountered. The crossing grew more difficult with every mile. Pumice and other volcanic debris struck the ships. Fragments floated across the water in increasing numbers. Conditions became hazardous enough that one captain advised retreat. Pliny refused. The mission continued. Shorelines near the volcano proved inaccessible as debris accumulated and waves became erratic. Reaching the intended destination no longer seemed possible. The fleet altered course and headed for Stabiae, south of Pompeii. There, Pomponianus waited with ships loaded for departure. An unfavorable wind prevented escape, holding the vessels close to shore despite every reason to leave. Into that atmosphere of uncertainty walked Pliny. Accounts describe him greeting his friend warmly, sharing a bath, eating dinner, and behaving with composure. Whether that calm reflected genuine confidence or a deliberate effort to steady those around him remains impossible to know. Night settled over the bay. Ash continued to fall. Tremors moved through the ground. Launching ships remained impractical as rough water battered the coast. Within the house at Stabiae, amid a landscape being reshaped by forces no Roman fully understood, Pliny the Elder eventually lay down to sleep. According to his nephew, his snoring carried through the rooms while the darkness deepened outside. One choice made in an ordinary moment became one of the most important decisions in the history of volcanology. A 17-year-old student stood at Mycenum while ships prepared to cross the bay. His uncle invited him to come. He declined, preferring to continue his studies. That student was Pliny the Younger, and the decision left him behind to become the only eyewitness whose account survives in written form. Mycenum lay about 30 kilometers from Vesuvius, which is about 18.6 miles, across the water at the northwestern edge of the bay. Distance offered a measure of protection during the eruption's first stages, yet the disaster remained impossible to ignore. The towering column dominated the horizon. Ash drifted through the air. Tremors rolled beneath buildings. News and rumor spread together through streets crowded with anxious residents. From that position, Pliny could observe events unfolding while still experiencing their reach. As daylight faded, the ground grew increasingly restless. Shocks arrived again and again, strong enough to rattle walls and unsettle furniture. Pliny later described how people debated whether remaining indoors or venturing outside carried greater risk. Neither option felt secure. The sea itself behaved strangely. Water appeared to withdraw from portions of the shoreline, exposing areas normally covered by the bay. Modern scientists interpret this as a consequence of seismic disturbances associated with the eruption. His mother urged caution and encouraged departure. Pliny hesitated. Part of his attention remained fixed on the absence of his uncle, who had sailed toward the disaster many hours earlier. While uncertainty spread through Misenum, he continued observing, reading, and recording details in memory. The habits of a scholar persisted even as familiar surroundings became increasingly unstable. During the darkest part of the night, the atmosphere changed from unsettling to overwhelming. Darkness produced by the ash cloud thickened further as the eruption intensified offshore. Pliny compared it to a lamp extinguished inside a closed room. Torches and lanterns flickered through streets crowded with fleeing families. Voices rose from every direction. Some people called to relatives. Some searched for friends. Others interpreted the catastrophe through religion, believing cosmic forces were remaking the world around them. Eventually, Pliny and his mother joined the movement away from the shoreline. Their flight became one of the most memorable passages in his later account. He described his mother urging him to save himself if necessary, convinced that her age might slow his escape. He refused to abandon her. Together they moved with the crowd through ash and confusion, while tremors continued beneath their feet. The account survived because, roughly 25 years later, the historian Tacitus requested details about the eruption and the death of Pliny the Elder. In response, Pliny the Younger composed 2 letters. Those letters became the foundation of nearly everything known about the event from a human perspective. They provide the chronology, the descriptions of darkness, the behavior of the sea, and the appearance of the towering eruption column. Their influence reached far beyond Roman history. The sustained vertical column he described, rising high into the atmosphere before spreading outward like the crown of a Mediterranean pine, became the defining model for an entire category of eruptions. Today, volcanologists still use the term Plinian eruption, preserving the memory of a young observer who watched from across a bay, carried the experience through decades, and finally set it into words. The figures preserved by archaeology tell a story that differs from the popular image of Pompeii. The city is often imagined as a place where an entire population vanished beneath volcanic debris. Excavation reveals something more complicated. Of the roughly 11,000 to 20,000 people who may have lived there, archaeologists estimate that about 2,000 died within the city. Most residents appear to have escaped before conditions became impossible. Evidence of departure appears in places where people rarely think to look. Stables stood without the animals that once occupied them. Horses had been taken away. Storage areas that should have contained carts were found empty. The harbor lacked many of the vessels expected in a functioning port. Wealthy homes yielded strong boxes stripped of coins, jewelry, and other valuables. These absences form a record as meaningful as any artifact. Families recognized danger, gathered what mattered most, and left while roads remained open. The timing of those departures proved crucial. During the first phase of the eruption, movement was difficult but still possible. Ash darkened the sky, and pumice accumulated steadily, yet routes out of the city remained accessible for many hours. Each passing interval narrowed the available choices. Streets rose beneath growing deposits. Travel became slower. Visibility worsened. Eventually, departure demanded more effort, more confidence, and more luck than many people possessed. The distribution of the dead reveals another pattern. Scientific studies of skeletal remains, including isotope analysis that can indicate geographic origin, suggest that many victims were not native to Pompeii. Some had arrived from elsewhere in the Roman world. Others may have been enslaved people, laborers, merchants, or travelers whose freedom to decide their own movements was limited. Social position influenced survival in ways that the eruption itself did not recognize. An unexpected finding emerges from several wealthy districts. Large houses belonging to prosperous families often contained victims who remained behind. Property can create powerful incentives to stay. A person surrounded by generations of possessions, business records, investments, and family treasures may hesitate when faced with evacuation. Archaeology cannot reveal every motive, yet the pattern appears repeatedly enough to suggest that attachment to place sometimes became a trap. Among the individuals recovered from the ash are stories preserved in fragments. At the Villa of the Mysteries, one man carried surgical instruments and coins, perhaps a physician attempting escape. Another victim appears to have been a soldier, equipped with weapons and protective gear. Within the house of the Cryptoporticus, adults and children were discovered together in a room where they had endured the long hours of falling pumice before the final catastrophe arrived. One of the most memorable discoveries was not human. In the house of Vesuvius Primus, archaeologists found the remains of a dog still attached to a chain. As debris accumulated, the animal climbed higher in an effort to survive. Its final posture, later preserved through casting techniques, records a struggle frozen in extraordinary detail. Modern disaster research offers insight into these choices. People frequently assume that dangerous situations will stabilize before becoming truly catastrophic. They postpone action while waiting for additional confirmation. The residents who remained in Pompeii were responding to uncertainty in a deeply familiar human way. The evidence suggests that many believed there would still be time tomorrow, even as tomorrow was steadily disappearing. Near 1 o'clock in the morning, the character of the eruption changed. For roughly 12 hours, a towering column had risen above Vesuvius, feeding itself with a continuous upward rush of gas, ash, and fragmented rock. Then instability began to spread through the lower part of that column. Material that could no longer remain suspended started collapsing back toward the ground. A different phase of the disaster was beginning, one that carried danger outward across the landscape with extraordinary speed. Modern volcanology calls these flows pyroclastic density currents. They are mixtures of superheated gas, ash, and volcanic debris that move close to the ground like an avalanche made of fire and dust. Gravity drives them downslope, while volcanic energy continues to feed them from behind. Their velocity can match that of a car traveling along a highway. Their temperature can transform the surrounding environment in moments. Unlike the falling pumice that had burdened Pompeii for hours, these currents allowed little opportunity for reaction. Herculaneum stood directly in their path. Positioned at the foot of the volcano, only 7 kilometers away, which is about 4.3 miles, the town occupied one of the most vulnerable locations around the Bay of Naples. During the previous hours, fortune had seemed to favor its residents. Wind carried the main eruption cloud elsewhere. Roofs remained standing. Streets avoided the bombardment that had overwhelmed neighboring communities. Many inhabitants had already escaped. Those who remained had spent the night waiting. About 300 people gathered in the stone boathouses built into the sea wall below the town. These arched chambers opened toward the shoreline and offered protection from falling debris. Darkness surrounded them. Sulfur drifted through the air. Across the water lay the hope of rescue. Roman ships had been launched. News traveled imperfectly through confusion and distance, yet the possibility of evacuation by sea remained believable. The hours passed with uncertainty, though nothing in their experience suggested that the next few minutes would differ fundamentally from the previous 12. When the first surge arrived, it struck the beach with astonishing force. Research published in the journal Scientific Reports examined carbonized wood recovered from Herculaneum and used reflectance analysis to estimate temperatures between 495 degrees Celsius or 923 degrees Fahrenheit and 555 degrees Celsius or 1031 degrees Fahrenheit. At such temperatures, the surrounding air itself became lethal. The evidence left behind tells a remarkable story. Many skeletons were discovered in positions lacking signs of prolonged distress. Arms were not raised in defensive gestures. Bodies were not twisted into postures commonly associated with extended suffering. Researchers concluded that death occurred so rapidly that conscious reaction was effectively impossible. The surge reached the victims faster than the body could meaningfully respond. Among those recovered was the woman archaeologists later named the Ring Lady, still wearing her gold jewelry. Nearby lay the surgeon with his carefully assembled instruments. A military officer remained beside his weapons and equipment. Each possession speaks of expectations carried into that night, rings intended to be worn again, tools prepared for future work, equipment meant for another day. The objects endured, preserved by the same event that ended the lives of those who carried them. Heat leaves different signatures depending on its intensity. A cooking fire alters food over minutes. A furnace reshapes metal over hours. The first pyroclastic surge that reached Herculaneum operated on an entirely different scale. It carried temperatures approaching 500 degrees Celsius or 932 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough that ordinary biological processes ceased to matter. In those conditions, the body encountered forces that transformed living tissue almost as rapidly as physical material can change. Human life depends on proteins maintaining precise three-dimensional structures. Those structures begin to unravel at temperatures above roughly 60 degrees Celsius or 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Cells lose integrity, membranes fail, and essential chemical reactions stop functioning. At 500 degrees Celsius or 932 degrees Fahrenheit, these changes occur with extraordinary speed. The distinction between injury and destruction becomes difficult to separate. Tissue is exposed to thermal energy far beyond anything the body evolved to endure. The skeletons recovered from Herculaneum preserve evidence of this encounter. Researchers examining the remains identified cracking patterns on portions of the skull, consistent with rapid heating and pressure buildup. Fluids enclosed within the body respond differently from bone. Blood, water, and cerebrospinal fluid expand when heated. If temperature rises faster than those fluids can escape, pressure accumulates inside confined spaces. Some skull fragments appear to record that process in their fracture patterns, preserving a physical trace of events that unfolded in moments. Other clues emerged during microscopic examination. Small dark residues found on certain skull surfaces attracted scientific attention because their composition differed from ordinary ash deposits. Studies suggested that at least some of these marks may represent biological material altered by extreme temperatures. Such findings provided another glimpse into the extraordinary thermal conditions that swept through the shoreline chambers during the first surge. One discovery became especially famous. Inside the Collegium Augustalium, a sanctuary associated with the imperial cult of Augustus, Archaeologists recovered the remains of a man believed to have served as the building's custodian. He appears to have been resting on a wooden bed when the surge arrived. In 2020, forensic anthropologist Pier Paolo Patrone and colleagues reported finding fragments of glossy black material within the skull cavity. Laboratory analysis indicated that the substance originated from biological tissue and had undergone vitrification. Vitrification occurs when material is heated to very high temperatures and then cooled rapidly enough that it forms a glass-like structure instead of crystallizing. The sequence proposed for Herculaneum is striking. An intense thermal pulse passed through the town, exposing tissue to extreme heat. Soon afterward, volcanic deposits accumulated around the remains, altering the cooling process. Under those unusual conditions, a portion of one person's neural tissue appears to have transformed into glass. Nearly 1,941 years later, scientists studying the skull encountered those fragments and began unraveling their story. Discussion continues regarding the exact mechanism of death. Some researchers argue that thermal injury alone explains the evidence. Others emphasize catastrophic damage to the respiratory system, with superheated gases and ash destroying airways and causing rapid asphyxiation. The details remain under examination. Across differing interpretations, one conclusion remains stable. The people gathered in the boathouses died within fractions of minutes, long before the city above them disappeared beneath volcanic deposits. A shoreline can become a waiting room when every path inland has turned uncertain. During the hours before dawn at Stabiae, that narrow strip between land and sea filled with people watching conditions worsen around them. Ash had been falling for hours. Tremors moved through the ground at irregular intervals. Sleep came only in fragments. At some point during that long night, Pomponianus woke his guest. Remaining inside no longer seemed wise. Material accumulating on roofs posed its own danger, and the group decided to move toward the beach and attempt departure by ship. Accounts preserved through Pliny the Younger allow a partial reconstruction of the scene. Men gathered near the waterline, beneath a sky obscured by volcanic debris. The sea, which had earlier carried rescue vessels across the bay, refused to cooperate. Waves remained unsettled, making launch attempts hazardous. Along the slopes of Vesuvius, points of fire flickered through the darkness. Air carried volcanic gases and drifting ash. Every breath demanded effort. Among those standing on the beach was Gaius Plinius Secundus, known to history as Pliny the Elder. He was no longer a young man. His nephew described him as stout, suggesting a body type that modern observers would likely consider overweight. Some historians have proposed that he may also have suffered from respiratory difficulties. No medical record survives to confirm such a diagnosis, yet the possibility matters because volcanic gases can become especially dangerous for individuals whose lungs already struggle under ordinary conditions. Witnesses remembered that he required support while moving. At one point, he leaned upon two enslaved attendants as conditions deteriorated around the group. Sulfur compounds mixed with airborne particles from the eruption, creating an atmosphere increasingly difficult to tolerate. Each inhalation brought material that irritated airways and reduced comfort. Physical exertion added another burden. Reaching the shore, evaluating the sea, and remaining mobile demanded energy from people who had already endured a night of uncertainty. Then came the moment that later generations would examine with fascination. According to the account transmitted by his nephew, Pliny rose with assistance and abruptly collapsed. The description contains little indication of prolonged suffering. There is no extended sequence of decline, no detailed record of final words. One moment he was standing, the next he was on the ground. Modern medical interpretations often point toward cardiac arrest, triggered by toxic gas inhalation, possibly combined with exhaustion and pre-existing health vulnerabilities. Absolute certainty remains impossible after nearly 2,000 years. When daylight returned, survivors located his body on the beach. The eruption had not torn him apart. No major injuries were reported. His posture attracted particular notice because it lacked the signs commonly associated with a violent death. Pliny the Younger wrote that his uncle appeared more like a sleeping man than a dead one. The image remained fixed in the historical record, carried forward through centuries of retelling. A final irony rests within that scene. Few people of his era devoted more effort to studying nature. His great work, Natural History, attempted to gather knowledge about the world into a single immense collection. He cataloged animals, plants, minerals, astronomy, and countless observations drawn from Roman learning. Yet, the mountain across the bay concealed a reality he did not recognize until it had already transformed the region. His life ended in the presence of a phenomenon he sought to understand, and his memory endured through the writings of the nephew, who watched from afar and preserved the story. Volcanic eruptions do not always move in a steady rhythm. They pulse, hesitate, reorganize, then strike again. During the pre-dawn hours of the second day, after the first destructive surges had swept through parts of the Bay of Naples, Vesuvius entered a brief interval of relative stability. The eruption column, which had begun collapsing in stages, partially re-established itself. For a short time, the mountain seemed to pause between acts of destruction. Within Pompeii, that pause mattered. People who had endured the long darkness found themselves facing another decision. Roofs had already failed across sections of the city. Streets had changed shape under deep accumulations of pumice. Every step required effort. Archaeological measurements indicate that deposits in some locations had reached several meters in depth. Movement remained possible, though increasingly difficult. Those who still believed escape could succeed, gathered what they could carry, and headed toward the city gates. The evidence survives in the positions where lives ended. Bodies discovered in roads and near exits reveal motion rather than shelter. These were not people waiting indoors. They were travelers within their own city, attempting to cross a landscape transformed during a single night. Coins, jewelry, tools, and small personal possessions accompanied many of them. Such objects suggest preparation for departure, the hope that a destination still existed beyond the falling debris. One discovery, excavated in 2021, captures that moment with unusual clarity. Near the Nuceria Gate, archaeologists found the remains of a man caught while moving toward the edge of the city. A lamp remained in one hand. Over his head, he held a bowl, apparently using it as protection against material descending from above. His posture preserved the shape of motion itself, a stride interrupted. The lamp speaks of darkness. The bowl speaks of persistence. Together they form a brief record of practical decisions made in impossible conditions. Scientific work published in the journal Science during 2022 refined the chronology of the eruption through detailed analysis of volcanic layers. The deposits revealed a sequence of pyroclastic surges arriving at intervals through the night. Earlier interpretations treated some events differently, yet the newer reconstruction suggests repeated pulses moved across the region approximately every 80 minutes. Each carried heat, ash, and gas. Each altered the landscape further. Each reduced the opportunities for survival. As dawn approached, the city remained occupied by people who had already overcome many hours of danger. Some sheltered where they believed walls still offered protection. Others continued searching for routes outward. Around them stood buildings, weakened by accumulating weight. Roads had become channels through drifting volcanic material. Familiar landmarks emerged only partially from the deposits surrounding them. Then came the eruption pulse, that stratigraphic evidence identifies as the most destructive to reach Pompeii. Estimated at approximately 7 minutes after 7 in the morning, it differed from the weaker surges that had arrived earlier. This current carried far greater density and thermal energy, the product of a major column collapse. It crossed the city with extraordinary speed. The night had stretched uncertainty across many hours. The final surge compressed everything into moments. Streets, homes, courtyards, and escape routes vanished beneath a moving cloud of ash and gas. Pompeii's long struggle ended there, within a span measured in seconds rather than hours. After the final surge passed and the movement of ash settled, Pompeii entered a different state of existence. Streets disappeared, roofs vanished beneath deposits, rooms filled and sealed. Within that new landscape lay the bodies of those who had not escaped. Fine volcanic material drifted into every space around them, wrapping itself around clothing, hair, hands, and faces with extraordinary precision. Layer by layer, the ash recorded forms that would remain concealed for centuries. Time then performed a second transformation. The soft tissues of the dead gradually decayed within their hardened shells of volcanic sediment. Flesh disappeared, fabric weakened, wood rotted. Bones remained, yet around many skeletons an empty space survived. Each cavity preserved the shape of a person exactly as that person had rested when the eruption ended their life. The city became filled with invisible impressions, human outlines suspended inside stone. During the 19th century, excavators uncovered evidence of these strange hollows. Giuseppe Fiorelli, appointed director of Pompeii's excavations in 1860, recognized that certain voids contained skeletal remains surrounded by empty space. He understood that the cavities themselves were valuable evidence. In 1863, he attempted something no archaeologist had tried before. Through a small opening, liquid plaster was poured into one of the hollow forms and allowed to harden. When the surrounding ash was carefully removed, a human figure emerged. The result astonished everyone who saw it. Archaeology had often recovered objects, walls, inscriptions, and bones. Fiorelli's method revealed something far more immediate. The cast preserved a person in 3 dimensions. Facial features appeared. Fingers remained folded exactly where they had been. Clothing left impressions in the plaster. Muscle tension survived as shape. The distance between the living and the dead seemed to narrow for an instant. Italian writer Luigi Settembrini, reflecting on the first casts, observed that people long dead appeared once more as human beings visible in their final struggle. As excavation continued, more forms emerged from the volcanic deposits. A mother and child appeared together. 2 individuals rested against one another. One figure covered part of the face with a cloak. Near a house belonging to Vesuvius Primus, a dog was preserved in a tightly curled posture, its body lifted upward as rising pumice reduced the space available to it. Other figures remained seated against walls. Some were discovered in roads, captured during movement. Across more than 100 casts, no single story repeats. Each preserves a different response to the same catastrophe. Certain postures puzzled early observers. Many victims displayed bent limbs, clenched hands, and raised arms. The arrangement resembled a defensive stance and became known as the pugilistic pose. Later, forensic research provided a different explanation. Exposure to intense heat causes muscles and tendons to contract as body tissues lose moisture. The position reflects a physical reaction to thermal conditions, not conscious resistance or combat. For all their detail, the casts preserve only the exterior instant. They do not record thoughts, sensations, or the precise experience of death. Modern studies indicate that thermal shock and toxic gases likely ended many lives very rapidly. Expressions that appear anguished to modern viewers are products of heat acting upon muscles after death overtook the body. What remains is a shell of a moment, preserved in volcanic ash, carrying a human presence across nearly 2,000 years. When the mountain finally exhausted itself, the shoreline, fields, roads, and towns around the Bay of Naples no longer matched the landscape, remembered by those who had survived. Pompeii disappeared beneath between 4 and 6 meters of volcanic debris, which is about 13 to 20 feet. Herculaneum vanished beneath nearly 20 meters of hardened pyroclastic deposits, which is about 66 feet. Entire neighborhoods ceased to exist as visible places. From above, there was little to suggest that thriving communities remained entombed below. Attention soon turned from the dead to the living. Emperor Titus dispatched officials to assess the catastrophe and coordinate relief across the affected region. Ancient writers describe efforts to assist survivors, redistribute resources, and restore stability. The emperor himself traveled to the area, placing imperial authority in direct contact with the disaster zone. Families who had lost homes were resettled in neighboring settlements. Donations arrived from different parts of the Roman world. Life continued, carried forward by necessity, while the buried cities remained where they had fallen. Excavation never became a serious possibility. The depth of burial alone placed the task beyond practical reach. Clearing several meters of compacted volcanic material from an entire city would have demanded labor on a scale difficult even to imagine in the first century. Herculaneum presented an even greater challenge. There, volcanic deposits hardened into material so dense that later centuries would require iron tools and engineering techniques unavailable to Roman workers. The ruins remained inaccessible, sealed beneath their own tomb of stone. As decades passed, memory began to loosen. People still spoke of the eruption. Historians recorded it. Travelers heard stories. Precise geography, however, faded more rapidly than the event itself. Roughly 2 centuries after the disaster, Roman authors referred to Pompeii as a place belonging to an earlier age, while uncertainty surrounded its exact location. Fields spread across the burial zone. Farmers cultivated soil, enriched by volcanic minerals. Harvests benefited from the same eruption that had erased towns from the surface. Names drifted as generations changed. Settlements shifted. Roads followed new routes. Documents disappeared. Oral traditions narrowed and fragmented. The buried city remained below working farmland, while the label Pompeii gradually attached itself to communities elsewhere in the region before slipping away from common use altogether. During the Renaissance, a faint glimpse of the lost world briefly returned. In 1599, architect Domenico Fontana supervised construction of an underground channel intended to redirect waters from the Sarno River. His workers broke through walls decorated with frescoes and uncovered inscriptions left by Roman hands. The discovery might have transformed history centuries earlier. Cultural attitudes of the era shaped a different outcome. Some artwork revealed themes considered offensive by contemporary standards. Excavation stopped, Reports were filed. The exposed remains were covered once more, returning the city to darkness. 1,669 years separated the eruption from the beginning of systematic excavation in 1748. Across that span, the Roman Empire dissolved, kingdoms rose and disappeared, medieval societies flourished, the Renaissance reshaped learning, and the scientific revolution altered humanity's understanding of nature. Through every change, Pompeii remained beneath a farm field, preserved by volcanic ash, untouched by the centuries moving overhead. A farmer's vineyard stretched across the slope where an entire city slept beneath the earth. Rows of cultivated plants covered streets, courtyards, workshops, and temples without revealing what rested below. Then, on the first day of April in 1748, systematic excavation began under the direction of the Spanish military engineer Roque Joaquin de Alcubierre. Working for Charles of Bourbon, King of Naples, his crews opened trenches at a place known locally as La Civita, meaning simply the city. Within days, objects emerged from the soil that seemed to belong to another world. Most ancient discoveries reached excavators in fragments. Time usually reduced buildings to foundations and transformed daily possessions into broken remnants. Here, the experience was different. Workers uncovered rooms whose painted walls still carried vivid colors. Mosaics remained arranged exactly where Roman craftsmen had placed them. Storage vessels appeared intact. Wooden furnishings survived in forms rarely encountered anywhere in the ancient world. The catastrophe that had erased Pompeii from sight had also shielded it from weather, agriculture, warfare, and centuries of disturbance. As excavations widened, the city revealed details that ordinary history almost never preserves. Organic materials, normally among the first things to disappear, endured in remarkable abundance. Bread remained inside ovens, some loaves still bearing marks left by the bakers who shaped them. Storage jars held walnuts, almonds, chestnuts, figs, pomegranates, and olives. Fragments of fabric survived. Rope, leather, and wood endured where they would usually decay within years or decades. In one dwelling stood a wooden cradle, preserved through circumstances so unusual that it seemed less like an artifact than an interrupted moment. Writing covered walls throughout the city. Election advertisements painted beside streets remained legible. Casual graffiti survived alongside official notices. These markings carried voices across nearly 2,000 years, preserving jokes, opinions, complaints, endorsements, and ordinary observations. Historians had long known the Roman world through literature written by wealthy authors. Pompeii offered something rarer, traces left by people who never expected their words to become history. News of the discoveries spread across Europe with extraordinary speed. Artists, scholars, collectors, architects, and aristocrats traveled to see the buried city. The rediscovered houses transformed ideas about Roman life. Visitors encountered kitchens, bedrooms, gardens, workshops, and dining rooms instead of distant historical abstractions. Ancient Rome became a place populated by recognizable people who cooked meals, decorated walls, raised children, and argued about local politics. The influence helped fuel the movement known as neoclassicism, shaping architecture, painting, interior design, and cultural taste throughout the continent. The earliest excavations, however, followed priorities very different from modern archaeology. Alcubierre's mission focused heavily on recovering impressive objects for the royal collection. Artworks were removed with limited documentation. Context often vanished during the process. Information about where objects had been placed and how they related to one another was frequently lost forever. When Swiss engineer Carl Weber joined the work in 1750, he pushed for more systematic recording and careful observation. His efforts brought improvement, though disagreements with Alcubierre became a recurring feature of the project. Even after more than 2.5 centuries of excavation, Pompeii remains incomplete. Roughly one-third of the city still lies buried beneath later development. Modern buildings occupy sections of the ancient settlement, placing large areas beyond immediate reach. New discoveries continue to emerge from ground that has remained sealed since the eruption, and the city still holds portions of its story in reserve. For more than a century after the rediscovery of Pompeii, excavators encountered the dead only in fragments. Bones appeared among layers of hardened ash, often separated from their original arrangement by decomposition, excavation damage, or the methods of earlier generations. These remains confirmed that people had perished in the disaster, yet individuality remained elusive. Names were absent, expressions were absent. The dead existed as evidence, though rarely as recognizable human beings. A different approach arrived in 1860 when Giuseppe Fiorelli became director of the excavations. His ambitions extended beyond recovering beautiful objects. He sought to understand the city as an organized whole. Streets, buildings, and neighborhoods were cataloged according to a systematic plan. Pompeii was divided into regions, insulae, and numbered structures, creating a framework that archaeologists still use today. Under Fiorelli's direction, excavation became a process of documentation rather than a search for treasures. During work in 1863, an observation changed the course of Pompeian archaeology. Laborers noticed that some sections of volcanic ash produced a hollow sound when struck. Investigation revealed bones embedded within these spaces. Surrounding the skeletal remains was emptiness, a cavity preserved inside the hardened deposit. The explanation emerged gradually. When victims died, fine ash settled around their bodies and hardened over time. Centuries later, flesh, clothing, and soft tissues disappeared, leaving behind voids that retained the exact shape of the person once enclosed there. Fiorelli recognized the extraordinary possibility hidden inside those cavities. If the empty space could be filled before it collapsed, the shape preserved by the ash might be recovered. His method was straightforward in principle, yet revolutionary in consequence. Workers identified a cavity, located an opening, and poured liquid plaster into the void. The material flowed through every preserved contour. After the plaster hardened, surrounding ash was removed with care. What emerged was astonishing. A human figure appeared where only emptiness had existed moments earlier. The casts preserved details no written description could equal. Facial features survived. Clothing folds remained visible. Hands retained their final positions. Individual fingers could often be distinguished. Some figures appeared seated, others seemed to be moving. A few rested beside family members. Each cast represented the outer form recorded by volcanic ash at the moment the body became part of the deposit. Archaeology had recovered artifacts before. Here it recovered presence. Across the following decades, more cavities were discovered and more casts created. 104 human casts have been produced through Fiorelli's technique. Displayed throughout Pompeii and within its museums, they offer an encounter with antiquity unlike any other. Visitors do not merely observe objects from the Roman world. They stand before specific individuals whose final forms were preserved through an extraordinary chain of geological and historical circumstances. The story continued into the 21st century. In 2015, the Archaeological Park of Pompeii launched a major restoration and research project focused on 86 surviving casts from the original Fiorelli series. Modern imaging techniques, including computed tomography scanning and radiographic analysis, revealed unexpected complexities. Many casts contained only partial skeletal remains. Earlier restorers had inserted stabilizing rods, added reconstruction material, and occasionally altered damaged sections. The figures proved to be layered records, shaped partly by the eruption itself and partly by 19th century efforts to preserve what the eruption left behind. A body cast from Pompeii may appear complete at first glance, its outer form fixed in plaster, its story already told. Modern science approaches these figures differently. Researchers now look beyond the surface, peering into spaces that excavators of earlier centuries could never reach. Each new technique adds another layer to the conversation between the living and the dead, revealing details that remained inaccessible for generations. Computed tomography scanning has become one of the most valuable tools in this work. Developed for medicine, the technology creates detailed images of structures concealed within solid material. Applied to Pompeii's casts, it exposes the bones enclosed inside the plaster without damaging the object itself. Age at death can often be estimated. Biological sex can sometimes be determined. Evidence of disease, injury, arthritis, and long-healed fractures emerges from the images. Features that once required invasive examination can now be studied while the cast remains intact, preserving both the scientific evidence and the historical artifact. These investigations have shown that many assumptions formed from appearance alone can be misleading. A figure's posture, clothing, or association with nearby individuals may suggest a particular story, yet biology occasionally tells another. That lesson became especially clear through genetic research published in November of 2024. Scientists extracted and sequenced ancient deoxyribonucleic acid from bone fragments preserved within 5 Pompeian casts. The results challenged narratives that had been repeated for decades. One cast depicted an adult wearing a gold bracelet while holding a child. The scene had long been interpreted as a mother protecting her daughter. Genetic analysis revealed something different. The adult was male, and the child showed no maternal relationship to him. Another group, frequently described as sisters because they were found together, proved not to be closely related. Stories constructed from appearances gave way to evidence preserved inside the skeletons themselves. The people remained real, though their connections turned out to be more complex than earlier observers imagined. The same study provided insight into the broader population of Pompeii. Genetic patterns showed strong affinity with people living in central Italy during the Roman imperial period. Trade routes linked Pompeii to distant shores across the Mediterranean world, and goods arrived from many regions. Yet the genetic evidence suggests a population that remained largely rooted within the Italian peninsula. Daily life unfolded within a cosmopolitan empire, while family histories often remained local. Other scientific methods trace journeys that genetics alone cannot reveal. Strontium isotope analysis examines tooth enamel formed during childhood. Because local geology leaves a chemical signature in drinking water and food, enamel preserves clues about where a person spent early years. Several individuals from Pompeii possess isotope patterns inconsistent with the volcanic landscape surrounding the city. They may have arrived as merchants, travelers, migrants, or enslaved people carried across the empire's networks. Research at nearby Herculaneum has expanded this picture further. A major skeletal study published in 2019 found excellent dental health among the victims sheltered in the boathouses. Cavities were uncommon, tooth loss limited, and average stature comparable to that of modern Italians. These findings describe a population that was generally healthy and well nourished. Their lives ended through the force of a geological event that offered little opportunity for resistance, leaving science to recover their stories many centuries later. A serving counter can reveal as much about a civilization as a palace. Across Pompeii, the remains of thermopolia, small establishments that sold prepared food to passers-by, preserve details of ordinary routines that rarely survive in the historical record. Emperors, generals, and disasters often dominate written history, yet these modest food shops record something closer to daily life. They show what people purchased on a busy afternoon, how ingredients moved through the city, and how commerce connected a single street to regions far beyond the Bay of Naples. Among the most informative examples is the Thermopolium of Reggio 5, excavated between 2019 and 2021. Its marble counter still contains embedded ceramic serving jars, each set into openings cut directly into the stone. Within those containers, traces of meals remained preserved. Scientific analysis identified residues from duck, pig, goat, fish, snails, and fava beans. The menu that emerged from those findings feels surprisingly familiar. Workers, travelers, laborers, and residents could stop briefly, purchase a prepared meal, and continue on their way through the city. The establishment functioned much like a modern street food counter, serving customers who did not always prepare food at home. The front of the counter carried another clue. Painted frescoes displayed animals associated with the dishes available for sale. A rooster appeared among the images. A duck was depicted as well. Nearby discoveries included animal remains corresponding to the creatures shown in the artwork. The paintings served a practical purpose. In a society where literacy varied considerably, pictures could communicate offerings immediately. A customer approaching the counter did not need a written menu to understand what might be available that day. Behind the serving area, storage spaces revealed a wider network stretching across the Mediterranean. Amphorae recovered from the site once carried wine imported from distant regions of the Roman world. Many vessels bore marks identifying their origins. Each container represented a chain of farmers, merchants, sailors, dock workers, warehouse operators, and traders. A customer purchasing a cup of wine in Pompeii participated in an economic system that extended across thousands of kilometers, which is about 1,864 miles of coastline, ports, and shipping routes. The Thermopolium was a neighborhood business, yet it depended on connections reaching far beyond the city walls. Recent excavations have expanded this picture of everyday activity. In Reggio 9, archaeologists uncovered a building preserved during renovation. Lime and mortar remained in mixing troughs. Amphorae filled with water stood ready for use. Construction materials waited where workers had placed them. Nothing suggested completion. The eruption interrupted a project still underway, preserving a worksite at a specific moment in time. Another discovery from Reggio 9 drew attention for a different reason. A fresco uncovered in 2023 depicts a round flatbread accompanied by fruit and a wine goblet. Pomegranates, dates, and seasonings appear among the toppings. Archaeologists emphasized that it was not modern pizza. Tomatoes and mozzarella belonged to later centuries. Even so, the image offers a glimpse of culinary traditions that feel unexpectedly familiar. Preserved by volcanic ash, the painting carries forward a fleeting scene from a meal that might otherwise have vanished without a trace. Some cities surrender their stories all at once. Pompeii has chosen a different path. After centuries of excavation, it continues to reveal rooms no one has entered since the eruption, tools left where they were last used, and traces of lives interrupted in the middle of ordinary work. The city remains unfinished as an archaeological project, with roughly one-third of its total area still buried beneath layers of volcanic debris and the modern landscape above. In February of 2023, the Archaeological Park of Pompeii began the largest excavation campaign undertaken in a generation within an area known as Regio 9. Portions of this district had been explored during the 19th century, yet large sections remained inadequately documented by modern standards. Archaeologists approached the work with a different philosophy from that of earlier excavators. Their goal extended beyond recovering impressive objects. They sought to reconstruct activity, movement, labor, diet, construction practices, and the sequence of events that unfolded during the city's final hours. Among the most important discoveries was a complete bakery preserved in remarkable detail. Millstones remained in their working positions. Circular channels worn into the floor still marked the paths once followed by the donkeys that powered the grinding process. Storage spaces for grain survived alongside areas where bread was prepared and distributed. At the rear of the complex, researchers uncovered the skeletal remains of three individuals. Analysis of their bones revealed signs of demanding physical labor. Evidence consistent with nutritional stress appeared as well. The bakery was not a monument to wealth or political power. It was a workplace, and the people connected to it carried the physical record of that work within their bodies. Nearby excavations revealed another essential component of urban life: a falonica, the Roman equivalent of a laundry and textile processing facility. Wool garments passed through such establishments for cleaning, treatment, and dyeing before returning to their owners. Vats associated with these activities survived within the structure, along with preserved organic traces connected to the processes carried out there. Discoveries of this kind rarely command the same attention as statues or treasures, yet they illuminate the routines that sustained an entire community. A city cannot function through ceremonies alone. It depends upon people who grind grain, wash cloth, repair buildings, and perform countless tasks that leave little trace in traditional history. The human dimension became especially clear through a modest room discovered earlier in the Villa of the Mysteries area and studied alongside recent findings. Inside stood three simple sleeping pallets, a chamber pot, a wooden chest, and a handful of personal belongings. Bronze objects, fragments of fabric, and everyday possessions suggested lives constrained by limited resources. The room offered no spectacle. Its significance emerged from its honesty. Few archaeological discoveries provide such a direct glimpse into the living conditions of individuals who occupied the lowest levels of Roman society. Every layer uncovered during the current campaign is recorded with tools unavailable to previous generations. Three-dimensional photogrammetric scanning preserves surfaces before removal. Soil samples are collected for pollen and seed analysis. Stratigraphic recording documents deposits with extraordinary precision. Through these methods, Pompeii continues to yield discoveries while preserving information for future researchers. More than 275 years after excavation began, the city remains larger than our understanding of it, offering new voices from streets that have not yet finished speaking. A layer of ash can function like a clock. Each deposit marks a particular moment. Each buried object occupies a specific place in the sequence, and each human body records the conditions present when that moment arrived. Modern forensic archaeology has transformed Pompeii from a story of collective disaster into thousands of individual encounters with the eruption, revealing that death came through different pathways depending on location, timing, and circumstance. For some residents, the danger emerged long before the pyroclastic surges reached the city. Throughout the night, pumice stones continued to rain from the sky, accumulating on roofs already weakened by years of seismic instability following the earthquake of 62. Buildings designed for ordinary weather faced a burden they had never been intended to carry. Archaeological excavations have uncovered victims trapped beneath collapsed masonry, roof beams, and fallen tiles within the lower pumice layers. Their skeletons show no signs of significant heat exposure. The evidence points instead to crushing injuries. These individuals sought protection indoors and remained there as the growing weight above them exceeded the strength of the structures around them. Elsewhere, another mechanism of death unfolded within the volcanic clouds themselves. Pyroclastic surges carried more than ash. They also transported gases released from the erupting mountain. Carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide moved through the landscape in concentrations capable of overwhelming human respiration. Some victims appear to have encountered these conditions in areas where temperatures were lower than those associated with the most destructive flows. Studies of skeletal remains and eruption deposits suggest oxygen deprivation played an important role in many deaths. A person caught within such a cloud could lose consciousness rapidly, even without direct contact with the highest temperatures generated by the eruption. The final and most lethal phase left a different signature. Victims overtaken by the strongest surges often display the posture known as the pugilistic pose. Arms bend toward the body, hands clench, and legs draw inward. Modern forensic science identifies this position as the result of intense heat causing muscles and tendons to contract. Bone coloration and thermal alteration provide further evidence of exposure to extreme temperatures. These people were struck during the eruption's most powerful currents, when collapsing material from the volcanic column swept across Pompeii, carrying tremendous thermal energy. Death in these cases appears to have occurred with great speed through thermal shock and respiratory failure. Recent stratigraphic research has added another layer of understanding. Investigators identified 17 distinct pyroclastic current events occurring between approximately 7 in the evening and 8 in the morning. Each surge deposited its own layer. Bodies found within lower deposits belong to earlier phases of the disaster. Others appear higher in the sequence, marking deaths that occurred hours later. The ash preserves chronology as well as preservation, creating a vertical archive of passing time. Among the most revealing discoveries are traces indicating that some people endured far longer than once believed. Footprints crossing fresh deposits, objects shifted between eruptive pulses, and bodies apparently repositioned by companions suggest intervals of survival between successive surges. The eruption unfolded across many hours, and for certain individuals, the struggle extended into the second day. Their presence within the layered deposits records not only death, but persistence, preserved within the same sequence of ash that finally brought the city to its end. History often lingers on those who remained, the forms preserved in ash, the streets frozen at the moment disaster arrived, and the lives interrupted without warning have become the enduring image of Pompeii. Yet the archaeological record tells a broader story. Most of the city's inhabitants survived. The destruction was immense, but it did not claim the entire population. Beyond the buried streets existed a much larger group whose lives continued elsewhere. The numbers provide the first clue. Excavations have uncovered the remains of roughly 1,150 individuals. even allowing for victims still resting in unexcavated areas or for remains that left little trace after centuries underground. The total falls far short of estimates for Pompeii's population before the eruption. The city likely contained many thousands of residents. Most departed during the early stages of the crisis, moving away while roads remained passable and before the deadliest phases of the eruption arrived. Their absence from the archaeological record is itself evidence of escape. Fragments of their later lives appear in documents scattered across the surrounding region. Modern researchers have traced names associated with Pompeii into the records of neighboring communities. Property sales, legal agreements, civic appointments, and commercial transactions reveal familiar individuals reappearing in places such as Cumae, Naples, and Puteoli. Within months of the eruption, former residents were conducting business, managing estates, and participating in public life. The catastrophe had displaced them, yet many remained connected to the economic and social networks that had shaped their world before the mountain erupted. The country they entered was altered in ways difficult to measure. Familiar landmarks had vanished beneath deposits of volcanic material. The shoreline no longer followed the same path. Roads disappeared beneath layers of debris. Fields, villas, workshops, and shrines that had organized daily movement across the landscape could no longer serve as guides. A person returning to the region after the eruption would have encountered a geography rewritten in a matter of hours. Places remembered since childhood existed only in memory. Relief efforts followed. Emperor Titus had recently ascended the imperial throne when news of the disaster reached him. Ancient accounts describe his personal involvement in the response. Commissioners were dispatched to oversee recovery and assistance. Property belonging to those who died without heirs was made available for the benefit of displaced survivors. The Roman state recognized that entire communities required support if ordinary life was to resume. Recent research published in 2024 suggests those who escaped were not permanently defined by loss. Receiving towns absorbed newcomers into existing social structures. Some survivors reopened businesses, others acquired property, entered local administration, or continued commercial careers interrupted by the eruption. The reach of Roman trade and communication helped distribute the burden across many communities rather than concentrating it in one place. Their stories survive in scattered signatures, contracts, and official records. They left Pompeii carrying memories of streets that no longer existed, then built new routines in other towns. The buried city preserved a moment of destruction, while the survivors carried its history forward through the ordinary continuation of life. From many streets around the Bay of Naples, the mountain appears almost ordinary. Vineyards climb its lower slopes. Towns spread across ground, shaped by earlier eruptions. Visitors photograph the summit and continue with their day. The same profile that watches over modern neighborhoods is the one that has remained present through nearly 2,000 years of history, never truly absent from the lives of the people around it. The eruption that buried Pompeii was only one chapter in a much longer record. Since the year 79, Vesuvius has erupted more than 50 times. Some episodes were modest, others destructive, each adding another layer to the relationship between the volcano and the communities surrounding it. Its most recent major eruption occurred in 1944 during the final phase of the Second World War. At that moment, armies were moving across southern Italy. Civilian populations were already enduring the disruption of conflict, and the mountain entered the story once again. Accounts from 1944 describe a landscape where military activity and geological forces briefly occupied the same stage. German troops were retreating northward, while Allied forces advanced through the region. Above them rose an eruption column visible across the countryside. Lava flowed through nearby settlements, forcing evacuations and destroying homes. At an airfield near Terzigno, North American Mitchell medium bombers stood parked on the ground when volcanic debris and lava damaged or destroyed numerous aircraft. The scene carried a strange quality, as though two entirely different histories had crossed paths for a few days before continuing on their separate courses. Since that eruption, the volcano has remained comparatively calm. Calm, however, does not mean forgotten. Scientists watch Vesuvius continuously through one of the most sophisticated volcanic monitoring systems on Earth, the Vesuvius Observatory. Established in 1841, is the oldest volcanological observatory in the world. Networks of seismometers listen for earthquakes deep within the mountain. Global Positioning System instruments measure tiny changes in ground elevation. Gas monitoring stations track emissions from the volcanic system, while satellites observe the region from orbit. At present, the official alert level remains green, indicating ordinary background activity. Around the volcano stretches one of the most densely populated volcanic regions on the planet. Roughly 3 million people live within the greater Naples metropolitan area. Within the designated red zone, the area considered most vulnerable during a future eruption, approximately 700,000 residents occupy 18 municipalities distributed across the slopes and surrounding lowlands. Roads, schools, businesses, apartment buildings, and farms fill terrain shaped by earlier volcanic events. Because of this concentration of people, planning has become as important as observation. The Italian Civil Protection Department maintains a detailed evacuation strategy built around transportation routes, staged warning levels, and receiving regions elsewhere in Italy. The plan is revised as conditions change and as new scientific data become available. No evacuation of the entire red zone has ever been required, and the challenge of moving hundreds of thousands of people remains the subject of continual study. Volcanologists agree on one point with unusual certainty: Vesuvius will erupt again. Geological systems operate according to timescales far larger than a human lifetime. The present interval of relative stillness is significant to people, yet within the history of the mountain it remains only another pause between eruptions. High on the slopes of Vesuvius, small instruments sit among rocks produced by earlier eruptions. They do not resemble monuments. They have no marble columns or carved inscriptions. Yet each device forms part of a long conversation between a mountain and the people who live beside it, a conversation shaped by lessons written during the catastrophe of the year 79. The chain connecting that distant eruption to modern science stretches across centuries. The account left by Pliny the Younger preserved one of history's earliest detailed descriptions of a volcanic disaster. The death of Pliny the Elder became part of the same story. Pompeii and Herculaneum disappeared beneath eruption deposits and later emerged as extraordinary records of what volcanic forces could do. From that accumulated knowledge grew a desire to understand volcanoes before they erupted. In 1841, that desire took physical form with the creation of the Vesuvius Observatory, the world's first dedicated volcanological observatory, established on the mountain itself. The Romans possessed attentive eyes and human experience, yet the mountain's internal movements remained inaccessible to them. Modern monitoring reaches into places no observer can see. Seismometers detect earthquakes far too small to be felt by people walking above them. Scientists can determine where those earthquakes occur, how deep they are, and how their patterns change through time. Global Positioning System instruments measure shifts in the landscape so slight that they are counted in millimeters. When magma moves underground, the surface may rise or tilt by tiny amounts, leaving a measurable signature. Gas monitoring stations analyze chemical changes emerging from vents and fractures, while thermal imaging identifies unusual heating across the volcano's surface. Each signal tells only part of the story. An earthquake swarm alone does not guarantee an eruption. Ground deformation may increase and later diminish. Gas emissions can fluctuate for reasons that never lead to volcanic activity. Understanding comes from combining many lines of evidence into a single, evolving picture of the mountain's condition. Scientists compare patterns, test interpretations, and continuously revise their assessments as new information arrives. Even with these capabilities, uncertainty remains a permanent companion. Monitoring systems provide warning, insight, and time for decision making. They do not provide perfect foresight. Volcanic systems are intricate, and periods of unrest do not always progress toward eruption. A sequence of signals that appears alarming may gradually fade. Another sequence may accelerate more rapidly than expected. For this reason, the instruments offer probability rather than certainty. One difference separates modern Naples from Pompeii more than any technological achievement. The people living around Vesuvius today understand that the mountain is an active volcano. Knowledge shapes daily life, public planning, scientific research, and emergency preparation. Yet people continue to live there for familiar reasons. The soil remains fertile. The bay supports commerce and culture. Families possess deep roots in the region. Cities accumulate memories that cannot easily be transferred elsewhere. Evacuation exercises, organized by the Italian Civil Protection Department, attempt to prepare for a future crisis, though no drill has fully replicated the challenge of relocating the entire red zone population. Planning continues because preparation itself is part of living beside the volcano. The monitoring stations stand upon deposits left by earlier eruptions. Their foundations rest on the products of the very processes they are designed to watch. Stone from the past supports instruments focused on the future, linking two eras through the same mountain. Across Pompeii, visitors pass frescoes painted with remarkable skill, walls covered in handwritten messages, workshops left in mid-task, and houses whose rooms still preserve the shape of daily life. Each discovery contributes something valuable. Together, they reconstruct a city. Yet one form of evidence reaches people in a different way, carrying a kind of immediacy that the rest cannot quite match. The plaster casts do not merely describe human lives, they present individual human beings. Archaeology usually works through fragments. A broken cup suggests a meal. A worn threshold suggests years of footsteps. A coin, a tool, or a piece of jewelry becomes a clue from which a larger picture can be assembled. The casts operate differently. They preserve the exterior form of a specific person at a specific instant. Arms, hands, clothing folds, the curve of a shoulder, even strands of hair in some examples survive in 3 dimensions. Information remains present, yet it arrives through physical presence rather than interpretation alone. Nothing comparable exists at any other archaeological site in the world. One of the most famous examples emerged from the House of the Golden Bracelet. There, excavators discovered an adult figure curved around a smaller body. For generations, the image appeared in books, museum exhibitions, documentaries, and educational materials as the ultimate expression of a mother protecting her child during catastrophe. The scene seemed self-evident. The posture encouraged a particular story, and the story endured for decades. Modern genetic research complicated that certainty. In the study published during 2024, deoxyribonucleic acid recovered from remains associated with several casts revealed that the adult in this pair was male. The child showed no maternal relationship to the larger figure. The discovery altered the narrative while leaving the physical evidence unchanged. The bodies remain arranged exactly as they were before. One figure still curves around another. What shifted was the meaning assigned by later observers. The cast preserves form with extraordinary precision, while interpretation continues to evolve as new evidence appears. A similar power resides in the cast of the dog from the house of Vesuvius Primus. Chained within its enclosure, the animal responded to rising accumulations of pumice by climbing as high as it could. The posture preserved in plaster records the limits of that effort. Knowledge of Roman politics, trade, or social structure is unnecessary to understand the scene. The connection occurs immediately. Across cultures and centuries, people recognize the body language of an animal in distress because the relationship between humans and dogs remains deeply familiar. When the earliest casts emerged in 1863, the Italian writer Luigi Settembrini struggled to describe what he had witnessed. He wrote that the dead had been gone for 18 centuries, yet still appeared as human beings visible in their agony, with the pain of death taking body and form. His words reflected the reaction of someone encountering a category of evidence unlike anything archaeology had previously offered. The casts do not reveal every truth. They preserve an exterior moment, while motives, thoughts, relationships, and personal histories often remain uncertain. Their importance lies elsewhere. They narrow the distance between present and past until history ceases to feel abstract. A city becomes individuals again, each preserved in a form that still occupies space in the world. A visitor standing before a Pompeii cast encounters an unusual sensation. The city is distant in every ordinary sense. Nearly 2,000 years separate its world from ours. Its language, politics, customs, beliefs, and daily routines belonged to a society long vanished. Yet the reaction many people describe is not curiosity alone. It carries a note of grief, as though the passage of centuries has somehow failed to create the emotional distance that time usually imposes. One explanation is familiar. Pompeii makes Roman history feel human. That observation is correct, though it does not fully account for the experience. Literature can achieve the same result. The warriors of the Iliad feel recognizably human despite the gulf of time. The letters of Marcus Tullius Cicero reveal friendships, ambitions, frustrations, and private concerns that remain understandable today. Countless historical sources narrow the distance between past and present. Few produce the particular emotional response associated with the casts. Part of the difference lies in the nature of the evidence itself. A text passes through language. A painting passes through an artist's hand. Even the most faithful representation contains layers of interpretation. The casts belong to a different category. The cavities discovered in the hardened deposits were created by real bodies as soft tissue disappeared over centuries. When plaster entered those spaces, it filled forms shaped by actual people. Every contour originated in physical reality. The result is not a symbolic depiction of death. It is a material record produced directly by an event that occurred in a single place and moment. Because of this, the casts occupy an unusual position between artifact and person. They are not human remains in the ordinary sense, yet neither are they conventional objects. A sandal, a lamp, or a coin can be admired while remaining comfortably historical. The casts resist that separation. They preserve posture, they preserve gesture, they preserve the arrangement of limbs at the instant movement ended. Through those details, an individual presence emerges with startling clarity. Time creates another layer of complexity. The years between the eruption and the present are entirely real. The people preserved in Pompeii lived under an emperor, walked streets that no longer function as streets, and inhabited a world shaped by assumptions very different from our own. At the same time, certain physical expressions remain understandable without translation. A hand raised toward the face, a body curled around another, a figure collapsing during an attempt to remain upright. These actions belong to no single culture. They communicate through forms shared across humanity. The encounter, therefore, contains a paradox. Distance and immediacy exist together. The viewer knows the individual before them died in the first century, yet the evidence arrives with a freshness that feels almost contemporary. Geology preserved a fraction of a second, and that fraction survived long enough to meet people living many generations later. Perhaps this reveals something important about archaeology itself. The discipline cannot restore the past in its entirety. Voices are lost, memories disappear, and countless details vanish forever. What archaeology can recover is evidence, fragments capable of supporting acts of imagination grounded in reality. Pompeii represents the furthest reach of that process, a place where physical traces remain so direct that the boundary between history and human presence grows unexpectedly thin. A loaf of bread waiting in an oven is not the kind of object history usually remembers. It carries no proclamation, marks no victory, and commemorates no ruler. Its purpose exists within the rhythm of a single day. Someone mixed the dough before sunrise, shaped it by hand, and expected it to be eaten before long. In Pompeii, that ordinary expectation remained unfinished. The baker left, and the bread stayed where it was. That unfinished quality runs through the entire city. Nearly every object recovered from Pompeii possesses it. Nothing survived because anyone intended it to survive. A lamp remained because no one returned to refill it. A shop counter endured because no customer arrived to continue the conversation interrupted there. Marks on walls persisted because later hands never covered them with fresh plaster. The eruption sealed thousands of small moments before the normal cycle of use, repair, replacement, and forgetting could erase them. Without the volcanic deposits, almost none of this material would exist today. Bread would have been consumed, tools would have worn out and been discarded, wooden furniture would have decayed. Election advertisements would have vanished beneath new campaigns. Daily life constantly destroys its own traces. Every generation clears space for the next day's needs. Archaeologists usually encounter only the fragments sturdy enough or important enough to resist that process. This creates a deep imbalance in the historical record. Most surviving evidence from the Roman world was designed to endure. Stone monuments, official inscriptions, public buildings, and commissioned artworks all possessed a degree of permanence from the beginning. They tell valuable stories, yet they describe only a narrow portion of human experience. Most people spent their lives cooking meals, managing shops, repairing roofs, raising children, carrying goods, settling arguments, and performing countless tasks that left little durable evidence behind. Pompeii interrupts that pattern. The deposits spread across rich homes and modest rooms alike. Dining halls and workspaces entered the same archive. Luxury objects remained beside worn household items. A senator's residence and a laborer's sleeping area became part of a shared record. The mountain showed no preference for status, wealth, or reputation. As a result, the city preserves a rare cross section of urban life, one broad enough to include people who usually disappear from history. The walls provide some of the clearest examples. Thousands of inscriptions remain scattered throughout the city. These texts were never intended for future readers. They include jokes, greetings, complaints, arithmetic exercises, political endorsements, declarations of affection, and exchanges between neighbors. Their language often feels immediate, carrying the rhythm of conversation rather than literature. Through them, individual voices emerge without the filtering effect of official record keeping. For that reason, Pompeii's greatest subject is not disaster. The eruption made preservation possible, yet, preservation is only the mechanism. The true focus is ordinary existence itself. The city reveals what people were doing when they were not attempting to make history. Empires rise and fall, religions change, governments disappear, languages evolve into new forms. Across nearly 2,000 years, many of those larger structures have faded. A fingerprint pressed into bread dough before baking remains. It belongs to an ordinary morning, preserved by chance, carrying the presence of a person whose name is unknown, yet whose touch still survives. Imagine a city that never experienced disaster. Streets remain active, houses are repaired, shops change owners, walls are rebuilt, expanded, or demolished. New generations alter old neighborhoods according to their own needs. After centuries pass, very little of the original city remains untouched. The traces of ordinary life are consumed by the ordinary passage of life itself. This is the condition of most human settlements. Pompeii exists before us because its story unfolded differently. At the center of Pompeii's survival lies a difficult contradiction. The eruption that destroyed the city is also the reason the city remains available to study. Had the volcanic deposits never arrived, Pompeii would have continued evolving like every other Roman settlement. Buildings would have been renovated repeatedly. Older structures would have disappeared beneath newer construction. Household objects would have worn out and been discarded. The countless details of daily existence would have dissolved into the normal cycle of use and replacement. Ironically, preservation emerged from interruption. Other cities reveal what usually happens. Rome endured through centuries of continuous occupation. Layers of construction accumulated upon one another as emperors, popes, merchants, and governments reshaped the same landscape. Naples followed a similar path, growing atop earlier Greek and Roman foundations. Even nearby Herculaneum presents a different outcome. Portions of the ancient town remain inaccessible because the modern community of Ercolano stands above them. Living cities continuously revise themselves, often at the expense of their earlier forms. Pompeii followed another trajectory. A specific event on a specific day halted change. Streets stopped functioning as streets. Workshops ceased production. Homes remained fixed in the state they occupied during their final hours. Time, which usually transforms a city gradually, encountered a barrier of volcanic deposits. The urban landscape entered a kind of suspension. Centuries passed overhead, while the arrangement below remained largely undisturbed. The same material that ended lives also became a protective covering. Ash and volcanic debris buried walls, rooms, tools, and possessions. Organic materials that would ordinarily vanish survived under unusual conditions. Paint remained on walls, graffiti remained on plaster, objects remained where they had been left. When excavators eventually uncovered the city many centuries later, they encountered a record far more complete than anyone might reasonably expect from the Roman world. There is nothing comfortable about this reality. Pompeii's value as a source of historical knowledge depends upon a catastrophe that brought suffering to thousands of people. The city, preserved for future understanding, is inseparable from the disaster that overwhelmed it. Every insight gained from its streets exists because lives were interrupted and communities were shattered. Knowledge and loss occupy the same ground. Another layer deepens the paradox. The things that survived were not selected according to human judgment. No committee chose what future generations should see. No archivist assembled the collection. Volcanic processes preserved a bakery, a tavern, a luxury residence, a workroom, a kennel, and modest sleeping quarters with equal indifference. Geology became the curator. As a result, Pompeii contains an archive unlike any other. Most archives reflect intention, preference, and cultural priorities. This one emerged from chance. A mountain created it. Destruction assembled it. Preservation followed. Through that unlikely union, an ordinary Roman city remains present, carrying details that would otherwise have vanished long ago. At this hour, while modern streets carry traffic and lights shine across the Bay of Naples, Pompeii still rests where it has rested since the year 79. Across roughly 64 hectares of preserved city, rooms, courtyards, workshops, and streets remain suspended within a story that never reached its intended ending. Even now, nearly one-third of the city remains covered by earth. Archaeologists continue to uncover spaces that no living person has previously seen, bringing forgotten corners of the city back into daylight, one careful layer at a time. Among all the discoveries made there, one of the smallest carries unusual weight. The loaf itself vanished long ago. Organic matter eventually decayed inside the cavity created by volcanic deposits. Yet, the shape remained. Within that preserved impression, archaeologists could still see traces left by the baker's hands. The pressure of fingers against dough survived when the bread did not. It was an ordinary action performed during ordinary work, preserved through circumstances no one present could have imagined. Those fingerprints remain startling in their scale. They are smaller than a mosaic, smaller than a coin, smaller even than many objects displayed in museum cases. A monument announces itself across space. A fingerprint speaks through proximity. It records a moment measured in seconds, a brief contact between skin and bread on a morning that appeared no different from countless mornings before it. The person who left that mark had no intention of creating a record. The record emerged only because geology intervened. The same event preserved countless other fragments of life. A dog remained fixed within its final enclosure. Medical instruments stayed where they had been stored. Jewelry rested beside the woman who wore it. Election notices survived on walls. Graffiti lingered in streets and passageways. A thermopolium, a Roman food shop, retained traces of meals once prepared for customers. A construction project remained unfinished, tools set aside in the middle of work. A modest room with 3 sleeping pallets endured alongside residences decorated with wealth and status. Thousands of artifacts have already entered collections and museums, while many more still wait underground, untouched since the eruption. Above all of this stands Vesuvius. The mountain remains part of the landscape, rising over the excavations and the modern communities that surround it. Roughly 3 million people live within the broader metropolitan region nearby. Instruments observe the volcano continuously. Seismic activity, ground movement, gas emissions, and thermal changes are studied with extraordinary care. Few mountains on Earth are watched so closely. The volcano that created the archive remains present above the archive. What endured through the ash was never intended to endure. Empires seek permanence and eventually fade. Governments pass. Religious practices change. Languages evolve into new forms. The eruption preserved something more fragile. It preserved a routine morning interrupted before it could become memory. The oven waiting for bread, the message written on a wall, the object set down for later use, the touch of fingers pressed into dough, all remained where time expected to erase them. The city still stands in the middle of that unfinished sentence. What the ash kept was life itself, caught in motion, ordinary and unannounced, continuing to speak across 1945 years.